Red Gorge was supposed to be just another quiet town, a place where people lived simple lives, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But that changed the day Grim Jack and the Steel Riders rolled in. Officer Jake Nolan, a former Marine and seasoned K-9 handler, knew trouble when he saw it. Jack wasn't just another outlaw, he was something worse. A man who took what he wanted and burned down anything that stood in his way. What started as a bank robbery turned into an all-out war. The town fought back, refusing to bow to the gang's rule. With Shadow by his side, Jake led the charge, pushing the riders to their breaking point. But taking down Jack wasn't enough. His network still lurked in the shadows, waiting for the chance to strike again. Now Red Gorge must do more than just defend itself. It must hunt the last of them down before they return, because Jack might be locked away. But the war for Red Gorge isn't over yet. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The Arizona sun burned hot over Red Gorge, a small town tucked between stretches of desert and jagged rock formations that had seen generations come and go. It was the kind of place where people still waved at each other on the street, where the only traffic jam was caused by Old Man Harlow's cattle getting loose on the highway. Nothing ever happened here, not really, and that's exactly why Officer Jake Nolan had chosen to stay. A former Marine turned K-9 handler, Jake had seen enough chaos for a lifetime. He didn't need the violence of the outside world creeping into his life again. He and his partner Shadow, a fierce and highly trained Belgian Malinois, patrolled the streets daily, knowing that most of their work involved helping lost tourists or dealing with the occasional drunk at Jerry's roadside bar. Today, however, felt different. Jake leaned against his squad car, watching as Shadow sat beside him, ears twitching, always alert. The dog had instincts sharper than any officer in the force, and right now he was tense. His body was stiff, his dark eyes scanning the street with the kind of focus that told Jake something was off. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, running a gloved hand down Shadow's back, but the tension in his own shoulders told him that maybe Shadow was onto something. The town's heartbeat was slow this morning. The usual sounds of life, distant laughter from the diner, the hammering from the construction site down the road, felt muted, like the air itself was holding its breath. And then it came. A low rumble in the distance. Jake turned his head slightly, his muscles tightening as the sound grew louder. It wasn't just the occasional motorcycle passing through town. No, this was different. This was a pack, the Steel Riders, a name that carried weight, even in places untouched by crime. As the first motorcycle appeared over the ridge, Jake felt a familiar pit settle in his stomach. It was the kind of feeling he got before things went sideways, the same feeling he'd had overseas when a routine patrol suddenly turned into an ambush. One by one they rolled in, black leather vests, boots caked in dust, faces hidden behind dark sunglasses, but their presence was enough to make the locals turn away, retreating into stores and closing doors that had been opened just moments ago. At the front of the pack was a man who needed no introduction, Grim Jack, the leader of the Steel Riders, a legend in the criminal underworld, a ghost in the law enforcement database. His real name? Unknown. His record? Long. But Jake knew men like him, men who lived by their own rules, who took what they wanted and left nothing but wreckage behind. Jack pulled his bike to a slow stop in front of the Red Gorge Bank, his boot touching the ground with deliberate ease. The other riders followed suit, their engines dying down one by one. Jake watched from his spot, his fingers unconsciously flexing at his belt where his sidearm rested. He wasn't the type to go looking for a fight, but he'd seen enough to know that trouble had just rolled into town. And it wasn't leaving any time soon. Shadow let out a low, guttural growl. Jake's grip tightened on the leash. Grimjack turned his head, his smirk sharp, his face worn by the kind of life that carves deep lines into a man's skin. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Jake, nodding slightly, as if acknowledging the only real obstacle in his way. Then just as quickly as he'd arrived, he turned away, stepping into the bank with 3 of his men. Jake exhaled, but he didn't relax. Not yet, because he knew a storm when he saw one. And Red Gorge was about to get hit. The Steel Riders had been in town less than 10 minutes, and already Red Gorge felt different. It was subtle, but Jake saw it. The way people disappeared from the sidewalks, the way shopkeepers pulled their doors shut just enough to seem unwelcoming, but not obvious. Fear didn't come loud and sudden in a town like this. It crept in like a slow, rising tide. Jake walked alongside Shadow, the dog's stance rigid, every muscle coiled beneath his sleek coat. The leash was loose, but Jake didn't need to tighten his grip. Shadow was disciplined, focused, a weapon waiting for a command. The bank's glass doors reflected the midday sun as Jake approached. Through them, he saw Grimjack standing at the center of the lobby, leaning one arm lazily on the counter. His men, 3 of them all cut from the same cloth, flanked him, their postures casual but predatory. A few customers sat stiffly in the chairs by the entrance, their eyes darting toward the men with a mix of caution and curiosity. The tellers behind the counter kept their smiles tight and their hands close to the silent alarm beneath the desk. Jake stepped up to the doors, pushing one open. The moment he entered, Grimjack looked over his shoulder. His smirk widened, like he'd been expecting Jake all along. "Well, well," Jack drawled, straightening up. "Didn't take long, did it? Not much happens in this town without me knowing about it," Jake said evenly. "Is that so?" Jack took a step forward, his boots heavy on the tiled floor. "Then you probably know we're just here for a little business." "That right?" Jake's tone didn't shift, but his eyes did, tracing every detail, every exit, every inch of space between him and the bikers. "I'm sure you don't mind me checking in." And then Jack chuckled low and rough. "Not at all, officer. In fact," he turned slightly, extending an arm toward the bank's interior. "Why don't you stick around? Could be fun." Jake didn't move. Shadow, still at his side, let out a quiet but unmistakable growl. Jack's smirk faltered just for a second. One of his men, a broad-shouldered brute with a shaved head and an old knife scar along his jaw, took a step forward. His vest bore a patch that read, "Tank." "Your mutt's got a problem?" Tank asked, his voice full of challenge. Jake kept his eyes on Jack. "My dog doesn't like threats." Tank grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Who's threatening?" Jack lifted a hand slightly, a silent order. Tank stopped moving but didn't step back. "Relax," Jack said smoothly. "No need to get all tense." He gestured toward the tellers. "We were just about to make a deposit. Nothing illegal about that." "Right." Jake didn't answer right away. His eyes flicked toward the bank manager, an older man named Henry Lawson. Henry's face was tight, the color drained from his skin. Something wasn't right. Jake took another step forward. "If you're not doing anything wrong," he said, "then you won't mind me watching." Jack let out a soft chuckle. "By all means." He turned back toward the counter, where the head teller, a young woman named Melissa, was trying to steady her hands as she counted the bills. Jack leaned against the counter again, looking at her with lazy amusement. "Something wrong, sweetheart?" he asked. Melissa swallowed hard but didn't answer. Jake clenched his jaw. This wasn't a simple bank visit. The air was too thick, the tension too real. Jack was doing what men like him always did, testing boundaries, pushing limits, seeing who would break first, and Jake had no intention of letting that happen. His voice came out low and steady. "You get what you need, Jack." Jack didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch as if savoring the moment. Then he straightened up, stuffing a wad of cash into his vest pocket. "Yeah," he finally said, "I think we're good here." He turned, walking slowly toward the exit, his men following like shadows. As they passed Jake, Jack paused, just inches away. He tilted his head slightly, lowering his voice so only Jake could hear. "Gotta say, officer," he murmured, "this town's got a nice feel to it." Jake didn't move. Jack smirked. "See you around." With that, the Steel Riders walked out, their boots echoing on the tile. Jake let out a breath, but the weight in his chest remained. This wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The morning after Grim Jack and his men strolled into Red Gorge, the town felt different. It wasn't something obvious. Not yet. No broken windows, no bar fights, no missing persons. But Jake could feel it. It was in the way people walked a little faster, the way store owners glanced out their windows more often. Fear had crept in, and fear was the first sign of control. Jake sat in his squad car at the corner of Main Street, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee. Shadow rested beside him in the passenger seat, head on his paws, but eyes always moving. The dog was as much a sentinel as Jake, and right now, both of them were waiting, watching. They didn't have to wait long. At exactly 9:03 a.m., a blacked-out van rolled onto Main Street, moving too slow for a town where everyone drove pickups and old sedans. Jake sat up slightly. His instincts were already screaming. The van stopped in front of the Red Gorge Bank, the same bank where Grim Jack had left his greasy fingerprints the day before. Jake straightened, setting his coffee aside. The van's back door swung open. 3 men stepped out, all in black, faces masked. No hesitation, no second-guessing. They moved like a unit, one heading toward the door, the other 2 breaking off to cover the sides. Jake was out of his car before he even realized he'd moved. Shadow, heel. The dog snapped to attention at his side. Jake's hand hovered near his holster. His heartbeat steady, controlled. He didn't need to run. Rushing in could get people killed, but every step he took toward the bank made it clear. This was happening. Inside, Henry Lawson, the bank manager, had just finished his morning routine. He'd counted the till, checked the registers, and was walking back to his office when the front doors burst open. The first man in fired a warning shot into the ceiling. Screams, chaos. "Everyone on the ground," the lead gunman barked, his voice muffled behind the ski mask. "Now!" Tellers and customers dropped instantly, hands over their heads. Melissa, the young teller from yesterday, was trembling as she pressed herself against the counter, her breathing shallow. Henry turned, raising his hands slowly. Please," he started. "There's no need for—" The gunman slammed the butt of his shotgun into Henry's stomach, dropping the old man to his knees. Jake was at the door. Through the glass, he could see the leader pacing near the counter, barking orders. The other 2 were moving toward the vault, one keeping his shotgun trained on the tellers. Jake's radio crackled. "Unit 1-4, we got shots fired at the bank. Status?" Jake pressed the button at his shoulder, his voice calm but firm. "Active robbery in progress. 3 suspects armed. Hostages inside. Need backup, now." His brain was already processing, running calculations. Storming in alone would be suicide. Waiting for backup meant giving them time to get into the vault. He needed an opening, a plan. He glanced down at Shadow, the dog's muscles twitching beneath his coat, waiting for a command. Jake exhaled. "Time to earn your keep, partner." The air inside the bank was thick with fear. The hostages, tellers, customers, the elderly couple who came in every Thursday to deposit their pension were crumpled on the floor, their hands over their heads. The gunman moved with practiced efficiency, barking orders, tearing through drawers, and pushing a terrified young teller toward the vault. Outside, Jake Nolan stood with Shadow, his mind calculating every possible outcome. A direct firefight? Too risky. The bank had windows, but none were ideal for a clean line of sight. If he forced entry, the gunman might panic and start shooting hostages, but if he did nothing, they'd be gone before backup even arrived. He had to act. He tapped his radio. "Dispatch, I need all available units en route. Code 211 in progress, hostages on site. Suspects are 3, possibly 4. Well armed. Coordinated. Shadow and I are engaging tactically." The reply came, static-laced but urgent. "Copy. Unit 1-4. SWAT is 40 minutes out. Local units responding within 10. 10 minutes. An eternity in a situation like this. Jake exhaled slowly, feeling the heat of the sun against the back of his neck. He had to close the distance. If he could get inside unnoticed, he could shift the balance. He looked down at Shadow. The dog's ears were sharp, his body tense, waiting. Jake knelt beside him, voice low. "You see those guys, buddy?" He nodded toward the bank entrance. "We need to get in there. We do it quiet. No mistakes." Shadow didn't blink. Jake moved along the side of the building, hugging the wall. The back door, a secondary exit for employees, was closed, but not locked. He tried the handle and felt the faintest resistance. Security measures weren't made for people like him. He pulled out his multi-tool and worked quickly, whispering under his breath, 5 seconds, in and out. With a soft click, the door gave way. Jake slipped inside, Shadow padding silently beside him. The hallway led into the main area of the bank, and from here he could hear the voices clearer. "Keep moving, sweetheart," one of the gunmen snarled. He shoved Melissa forward, her hands shaking as she worked the vault's digital lock. "One wrong move, and you get to watch this whole damn place go up." Jake's jaw clenched. That's when he heard the second voice. It wasn't one of the masked gunmen. It was him, Grim Jack. Jake hadn't seen him outside, hadn't spotted him going in. But now, standing just past the entrance to the vault, he saw him, leather vest, tattooed hands, grinning like he owned the place. "Don't take too long, fellas," Jack said, his voice smooth as oil. "I'd hate to see this go messy." Jake's mind clicked. This wasn't just a robbery. It was him. Grim Jack hadn't just rolled into town to stir trouble. This was planned. He wasn't here for the cash. He was making a statement, a warning. This town was his now. Jake reached for his radio, whispering, "Be advised, leader identified as Grim Jack. He's inside. Repeat, he's inside." The reply was immediate. "Confirmed, Unit 1 to 4. Stay in position. Local units are 6 minutes out." Jake cursed under his breath. 6 minutes was 5 too many. Inside, the situation was shifting. Melissa was at the final lock of the vault, and Jake saw the flicker in Grim Jack's expression. He was ready to leave. Jake needed to move. He leaned down, whispering into Shadow's ear, "Find him." The command was soft, barely audible. But Shadow knew exactly what it meant. The dog moved, slinking low, vanishing into the shadows. Jake followed, using the angles of the bank to his advantage. He crept forward, his fingers brushing the handle of his firearm, but keeping it holstered. A shot fired too early could ruin everything. Shadow moved with the grace of a predator, cutting along the back of the bank until he was just behind Tank, the massive biker who'd been ready to pick a fight the day before. The moment Shadow lunged, he did it without a sound. His teeth clamped down hard on Tank's wrist, twisting, forcing the man's body forward. Tank roared in pain, his gun clattering to the ground. Jake surged forward, one punch, swift, brutal, connected with Tank's jaw. He hit the floor like dead weight. Grim Jack spun at the sound, his smirk vanishing. His hand went to his belt. Jake didn't give him the chance. He tackled him, his momentum driving them both into the teller counter. Jack let out a grunt as the wind left his lungs. The other 2 gunmen reacted fast, too fast. A shotgun blast tore through the air, splintering the wood where Jake had been standing a second earlier. People screamed. Shadow snarled, lunging toward the second shooter, one of the men near the vault. He latched onto his leg, yanking him down. Grim Jack twisted under Jake's grip, his elbow smashing into Jake's ribs. Jake grunted, rolling, but held on. Jack shoved a knee into his stomach, breaking free, scrambling back as the last remaining shooter grabbed Melissa, dragging her backward toward the vault. "You let us walk," he shouted, pressing the barrel of his gun to her temple. "Or she dies." For the first time, Jake saw something in Grim Jack's face. Hesitation. A flicker of something that almost looked like contempt for his own man. Jake breathed hard, keeping his voice steady. "You're surrounded," he said. "Cops are almost here. You kill her. You don't walk out of this bank, not in one piece." Jack's eyes flicked to the entrance. He knew it. Jake saw the realization sink in. The man holding Melissa gritted his teeth, panic setting in. His hand twitched, just enough. Shadow lunged. His teeth sank into the man's wrist, twisting hard. A gunshot rang out, wide, wild, slamming into the ceiling. Melissa screamed. Jack moved, not to fight, to run. The doors blasted open before he reached them. Sirens wailed. Sheriff's deputies poured in, weapons drawn. "Drop it now!" Jack froze. His hands twitched, but his smirk returned. He slowly raised them in surrender. Jake forced himself up, breathing hard, his ribs aching where Jack had nailed him. The other gunman? On the ground. Shadow still had his jaws clamped on the last one's arm, snarling. Jack exhaled, looking around, and then tilted his head toward Jake. "Hell of a dog you got there, cop." Jake wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yeah," he said. "Hell of a dog." The Steel Riders had been taken down, for now. The bank was a war zone of shattered glass, overturned chairs, and the acrid scent of gunpowder hanging in the air. The hostages were being led out by the sheriff's deputies, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Some whispered thanks as they passed Jake, but he barely acknowledged them. His mind was already moving ahead, thinking beyond this moment, because this wasn't over, not even close. Grimjack was sitting in the back of a squad car, hands cuffed, looking as relaxed as a man at a Sunday barbecue. The smirk on his face told Jake exactly what he already knew. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Sheriff Howard, a thick-set man with a grizzled beard and years of service under his belt, walked up beside Jake, rubbing the back of his neck as he took in the damage. "Well," Howard exhaled. "Hell of a mess you got here." Jake didn't look away from Jack, who was watching them both from the squad car. "This wasn't just a robbery," Jake said. Howard let out a grunt. "No kidding. He didn't care about the money," Jake continued, jaw tightening. "They had access to the vault, had everything they needed, but he didn't try to run. He stayed. He wanted this." Howard folded his arms. "You think this was a test?" Jake finally turned, his eyes dark. "It was a warning. He wanted to see how fast we'd react, how we'd respond, and he wanted to make sure we all knew one thing. He's in charge now." Howard sighed, glancing back at Jack. "Damn bikers think they can roll into town and own the place. You think he's got people waiting for him outside?" Jake nodded. "I'd bet my badge on it." Howard spat onto the pavement. "I'll take him in, let the feds sort through his charges. But we both know how this goes." "He'll be out before the paperwork even clears," Jake muttered. Howard sighed again, rubbing his temple. "Then what the hell do we do?" Jake watched as one of Jack's men, still bleeding from Shadow's takedown, was hauled into another patrol car. He exhaled sharply. "We prepare," Jake said, "because this was just his opening move." Howard grunted. "And the next one?" Jake glanced down at Shadow, who was still at his side, his eyes locked onto Jack like he could sense what was coming. "The next one is war." 3 hours later, Red Gorge police station. The Steel Riders had been processed, photographed, and locked up in holding cells. Jake stood in the dimly lit hallway outside, listening to the sound of Jack laughing from his cell. It wasn't forced, it wasn't nervous. It was genuine amusement, like this whole thing was nothing more than a game. Howard stepped up beside Jake, arms crossed. "He's been like that since he got here." Jake clenched his jaw. Howard looked at him. "You want to talk to him?" Jake exhaled through his nose. "Yeah." Howard pulled out the keys, unlocking the heavy metal door. "Don't let him get in your head." Jake stepped inside. Grim Jack was sitting on the bench, his back against the concrete wall, stretching his legs out like he owned the place. "Well," Jack grinned, "if it isn't the hero of Red Gorge." Jake didn't react. He pulled out a chair from the metal table in the center of the room and sat down, his eyes locked onto Jack's. "You didn't come here for a bank job," Jake said flatly. Jack tilted his head, amused. "That right?" Jake leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "You could have left. You could have been long gone before we even showed up. But you didn't. You let yourself get caught." Jack's smirk widened. Jake's voice was steady, cold. "Why?" Jack studied him for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Because I wanted to see how fast you were," Jack murmured. "How smart you were, how much you'd risk." Jake clenched his jaw. Jack's grin turned sharper. "And you didn't disappoint." Jake sat back, forcing himself to stay calm. "So what happens next?" Jack exhaled, as if he were bored with the conversation. "What happens next is out of my hands." "That's bull, is it?" Jack interrupted, his grin vanishing in an instant. His voice was different now, lower, more dangerous. "You think this ends just because you put a few of my boys in cuffs?" Jack leaned forward, his fingers tapping the metal table. "You don't get it yet, do you?" Jake's hands clenched into fists. Jack's voice dropped into something deadly. "This town, it doesn't belong to you anymore." The words sent a slow, cold shiver down Jake's spine. Jack grinned, seeing the flicker in Jake's expression. He sat back again, stretching his arms. "Enjoy the quiet while it lasts, Officer Nolan." Jake stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He turned, walking toward the cell door without another word. Jack's voice followed him. "Because once I walk out of here—" Jake stopped. Jack's smirk returned, his voice playful again. "I'm gonna burn this place to the ground." That night, Jake's house. Jake sat on his porch, a beer untouched beside him, Shadow resting at his feet. His mind was racing, running through every possible scenario, every possible move Jack could make. And he knew one thing. Jack was right. This town was already his. Maybe not on paper, not yet, but the fear was there. And fear is control. Jake exhaled, reaching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "We're not gonna let that happen, boy," he murmured. "Not a damn chance." Shadow thumped his tail once, but didn't move otherwise. He knew better. A storm was coming, and Jake had no choice but to fight back. The night air carried the faint scent of desert sage and dust, but to Jake it reeked of trouble. He sat on his porch, staring at the dark horizon beyond his backyard fence. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching every time the wind shifted. The dog knew something was off, so did Jake. Grim Jack had been locked up for less than 12 hours, but Jake knew it wouldn't hold. Not a man like him. Not with connections that stretched beyond state lines. And sure enough, the call came. His phone buzzed on the wooden railing beside him. He picked it up without looking. "Nolan," he answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Sheriff Howard. It was tight, tired. "He's out." Jake's fingers curled around the phone. "How?" "Bail," Howard sighed. "Paid in full. Some lawyer from Tucson showed up with paperwork before sunrise. Couldn't stop it." Jake closed his eyes for a second. His grip tightened, but his voice stayed even. "Where is he now?" Howard hesitated. "Already gone." Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "That was fast." "Yeah," Howard muttered, "and I don't like it one damn bit." Neither did Jake. The town had barely started to breathe again after the bank job. Some folks had convinced themselves it was a one-time thing, a group of outlaws passing through. But Jake knew better. Jack didn't roll through towns. He took them. Jake ended the call and stared at the darkness beyond his porch. If Jack had been waiting for a moment to strike, it was now. And then, as if on cue, the roar of engines shattered the silence. Shadow lifted his head, a deep growl rumbling in his chest. Jake rose to his feet, grabbing his badge and sidearm as he moved toward his truck. The Steel Riders were back, and this time they weren't just testing the waters, they were here to take what they came for. By the time Jake pulled onto Main Street, it was already happening. The riders had spread out, moving like a swarm of locusts through the town. Storefronts that had just opened for the day slammed their doors shut as bikers loomed outside, revving their engines, shouting crude remarks at anyone brave enough to be caught on the street. Jerry's roadside bar was already a mess. One of the front windows shattered, a couple of bikes parked sideways on the curb as 3 bikers leaned against the doorframe, beers in hand like they owned the place. Jake saw a group of them outside the Red Gorge diner, surrounding a pickup truck. The driver, an older man, Sam, who owned the hardware store, was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles had gone white. One of the bikers, a lanky guy with a sun-bleached beard and a black vest that read Viper, leaned into Sam's window, grinning as he talked. Jake's gut clenched. This wasn't random intimidation. This was control, and they were establishing it quickly. Jake pulled up, parking his truck in the middle of the road. He stepped out slowly, making sure every single one of them saw him. The reaction was instant. The laughter died down. The bikers at the diner turned, Viper stepping away from Sam's truck with a smirk. The ones at Jerry's slowed their conversation, watching him with thinly veiled amusement. Jake said nothing. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, but his stance was firm, a challenge. One of the bikers, Tank, the brute who had been inside the bank, stepped forward, rolling his shoulders like he'd been waiting for this. His split lip from yesterday's takedown was still raw, his expression full of unspoken promises. "Well, if it ain't Officer Nolan," Tank grinned. "You know, we were just talking about you." Jake didn't blink. Tank spread his arms, nodding toward the street. "You see this? Your town looks different now, don't it?" Jake didn't give him the satisfaction of reacting. "I see a bunch of idiots wasting gas." Tank's grin flickered just for a second. The other bikers chuckled, but there was tension beneath it. Viper stepped closer, hands in his pockets. "Jack sends his regards," he said. Jake tilted his head slightly. "That right?" Viper nodded. "He also said to tell you something." Jake waited. Viper's grin widened. "You don't run this town no more." The moment the words left his mouth, the bikers around him revved their engines, the sound deafening in the small street. Jake barely heard the shout until it was too late. A bottle flew from behind him, shattering against the hood of his truck. His jaw clenched, but he didn't move. He knew exactly what they wanted. A reaction, an excuse. Shadow was already tense beside him, his teeth bared. Jake slowly exhaled through his nose. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice calm, controlled. "Now get the hell out of here before I start making arrests." Tank laughed. "Oh yeah, you and what army?" Jake didn't move, but the town did. Doors creaked open, people stepped onto porches. A handful of shop owners emerged from their businesses, arms crossed watching. And just like that, the numbers shifted. Jake wasn't standing alone anymore. He could see it in the bikers' faces. Doubt. Fear. Because a town that had been afraid the day before was watching them now. A few of the bikers exchanged glances. Some hesitated. Jake took a step forward, his voice lower now. "This ain't some back road town full of people you can scare off," he said. "You boys think you're wolves? Then take a good look around." He nodded toward the people gathering. "Because you just walked into a town full of hunters." Silence. Tank's smirk was gone. Viper shifted on his feet. The numbers weren't in their favor anymore. And then, as if knowing the moment was lost, one of the bikers behind them revved his engine. One by one, the others did the same. Tank stared at Jake for a long second, something unreadable passing through his expression. Then, with a snarl, he turned and walked toward his bike. Viper was the last to move. He lingered, eyes flicking to the crowd, then back to Jake. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head. "Jack's gonna be pissed," he muttered. Then he swung his leg over his bike and rode away. Jake watched as they peeled out of town, kicking up dust in their wake. He didn't relax. Not yet. Not until the engines faded into the distance. Not until the town exhaled. Howard pulled up beside him a moment later, stepping out of his car with a knowing look. "Well," Howard grunted, "that was a hell of a standoff." Jake nodded, watching the road. "They'll be back," he said. Howard sighed. "Yeah, but next time?" He looked at the people gathered on the street. "They won't find a town that's afraid anymore." Jake glanced at Shadow, then back at the dust settling on the road. "Next time," he murmured, "they're going to wish they never came back." The dust had barely settled from the Steel Rider's exit when Jake turned back to the gathered townspeople. There was no cheering, no sense of victory, just quiet tension. Everyone knew this wasn't the end. It was just a pause before the real fight. Sheriff Howard sighed, pulling off his hat and wiping his forehead. "Well, that went about as well as it could have," he muttered. Jake shook his head. "No, they were testing us, seeing how far they could push before we pushed back." He looked at the road, where the bikers had disappeared. "And now that they know we won't scare easy, they're gonna hit back harder." Howard frowned. "So what do we do?" Jake's eyes flicked to the people around them. The fear from yesterday was still there, but it was changing, turning into something else, a need to fight back. We make sure they don't catch us off guard again, Jake said. We set up watch shifts. We reinforce the businesses, make sure everyone's got a way to signal trouble. Howard scratched his beard. You're thinking about deputizing civilians? Jake nodded. Unofficially, we keep it quiet, but we stay ready. From the back of the crowd, Sam Lawson, the hardware store owner, stepped forward. His jaw was set, his fists clenched. We're not going to sit around and wait for them to burn our town down, are we? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jerry, from the bar, nodded. Hell no, we ain't. They think they can push us around, but this town's got some fight left in it. Jake looked at them, gauging their resolve. He could use this. He needed this. All right, he said. We do this smart. No one goes looking for a fight, but if one comes, we're ready. Howard exhaled. This is gonna get messy. Jake's expression hardened. Yeah, but we're not rolling over. Shadow sat beside him, ears twitching. He felt the tension, understood what was coming in his own way. Howard placed his hat back on his head, looking out over the town. If we're gonna do this, we do it right. We start now. The meeting broke apart, people murmuring to one another as they walked off with purpose. Some headed toward their businesses, others toward homes to check locks, reinforce doors. Jake watched them go, his jaw tight. This town had just made its choice. Now it was time to see if it was enough. Night settled over Red Gorge, the kind of deep darkness that only the desert could bring. The stars above burned bright, indifferent to the tension simmering below. Jake sat in his truck, parked near the bank, the same place the riders had hit just a day ago. His eyes scanned the street, watching. Shadow sat in the passenger seat, ears perked, body still but ready. The radio crackled to life. Howard's voice came through. Quiet on my end. You seeing anything? Jake pressed the button. Not yet. A pause. Then they'll come. Jake didn't doubt it. Another hour passed, then another. The stillness of the night stretched on. But Jake didn't relax. Shadow didn't either. And then a low growl rumbled in the dog's throat. Jake immediately tensed. He followed Shadow's gaze, scanning the street. And then he saw it. A single headlight, far down the road. Then another. Then 5 more. They weren't roaring in like last time. They were coming slow, deliberate. Jake grabbed the radio. We've got company. Howard's voice came back instantly. How many? 7. Maybe more. A long pause. Then, I'll call it in. Stay put. Jake smirked grimly. Not going anywhere. The bikers moved in, coasting down Main Street like they had all the time in the world. They weren't making noise, weren't breaking windows or harassing people. They were watching. Jake didn't move. Shadow's growl deepened. The lead rider, Viper, pulled up just across from Jake's truck. The others fanned out behind him, their bikes idling, the rumbling filling the silence between them. Viper smiled, tilting his head slightly. Officer Nolan. Jake didn't respond. Viper sighed, rubbing his beard. See, we came back because we figured you might have misunderstood us earlier. We weren't trying to start nothing, just letting you know how things are going to be. Jake exhaled slowly. That right? Viper nodded. Yeah, and we figured we'd spell it out real simple. He reached into his vest. Jake's hand went to his gun instantly, but Viper just chuckled, pulling out a matchbook. He tossed it onto the pavement between them. Jake didn't look away from him, but his fingers twitched, his instinct screaming. The matchbook had one word written on it. Tonight. Jake's pulse thudded once, hard. Viper smiled wider. See you around, officer. And then, just like that, they rolled away. Jake bent down and picked up the matchbook, flipping it over in his fingers. The message was clear. Something was coming tonight. He grabbed the radio. Howard, we need everyone on deck. Now. Howard's voice was sharp. What happened? Jake's grip tightened on the matchbook. They're planning something. Jake didn't waste time. Within the next hour, the town was awake. Sheriff Howard called in every available deputy. Business owners were alerted. Windows were boarded up. Firearms were checked. The town wasn't waiting to be attacked. They were ready. Jake stood in front of the diner, Shadow beside him, watching the darkness beyond the streetlights. Then an explosion. Flames erupted from Jerry's bar, the windows blasting out, sending shards of glass onto the street. Jake's radio crackled with Howard's voice. They hit Jerry's. We need... Gunshots, then static. Jake spun, adrenaline surging through him. Down the street, more flames erupted from the gas station. Bikes roared in from the shadows, dozens of them. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was war. Shadow barked, lunging forward, sensing the danger. Jake pulled his gun. The Steel Riders were here. They weren't taking over. They were burning the town to the ground, and Jake, he wasn't going to let them. The night erupted into chaos. Flames clawed at the sky, turning the quiet town of Red Gorge into a war zone. The fire from Jerry's bar spread fast, smoke curling down Main Street like a serpent, thick and choking. The gas station, still ablaze, sent a glow over the asphalt, casting flickering shadows of the approaching motorcycles. The Steel Riders weren't just here to make a statement. They were here to destroy everything. Jake didn't hesitate. His gun was already drawn as he sprinted toward his truck, Shadow moving in sync beside him. His mind was racing, calculating. Fire at the gas station meant an explosion was possible if the flames hit the underground tanks. Jerry's bar was gone, and there was no telling what buildings might catch next. But that wasn't the worst of it. The riders were everywhere, at least a dozen of them, their headlights blinding as they tore through town. Some were circling the hardware store, others smashing bottles against the diner windows. It was an orchestrated attack, fast, relentless, no room for the town to react. Jake's radio crackled as he dove behind his truck for cover. "Howard, talk to me!" Sheriff Howard's voice was sharp through the static. "They hit the station first, took out the radio tower. Dispatch is down. We're cut off." Jake's stomach twisted. That meant no backup, no state troopers, no SWAT. They were on their own. Gunfire popped somewhere down the street, short bursts, not random. The riders weren't just terrorizing, they were pinning them down. Jake peeked over his truck's hood and spotted a group of riders clustered near the general store. One of them, Tank, that massive bastard, was lighting a Molotov cocktail. The flames licking at the glass bottle in his hand. Jake didn't think. He aimed, pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, clean, precise. The bottle exploded in Tank's hand before he could throw it, sending him stumbling back, screaming as fire licked at his arm. The other riders turned, spotting Jake. Shadow snarled beside him. "Here we go," Jake muttered. He moved fast, ducking around his truck as the first bullets tore into the metal. Sparks shot off the hood, but he was already sprinting. Shadow darted forward, a blur of fur and muscle, weaving between parked cars. Jake needed to move. He dashed across the street, diving behind a row of crates outside the hardware store, just as another shot cracked past his head. His breath came fast, but his mind was locked in. Adapt, strike, move. A bike roared toward him, the rider aiming a pistol as he passed. Jake fired twice. The rider jerked, his shot going wide, and then his front wheel wobbled. He lost control. The bike flipped, sending him skidding across the pavement, helmet bouncing once before he stopped moving. Another engine revved behind him. Jake spun just as a blade slashed toward him. He barely dodged, the knife cutting through his jacket instead of his skin. The attacker, a wiry man with a sneer carved into his face, came in again, quick and mean. Jake blocked the next swing with his forearm and drove his elbow into the guy's jaw. The biker staggered, but before he could recover, Shadow launched. The dog hit him full force, jaws snapping onto his wrist. A scream tore through the night as the man dropped the knife, hitting the ground hard. Shadow held firm, teeth deep in the man's arm, pinning him down. Jake didn't have time to acknowledge it. Another rider was coming, this one holding a sawed-off shotgun. Jake grabbed the fallen knife and threw it. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't have to be. The blade slammed into the biker's thigh, making him stumble. Jake fired next. One shot. The biker dropped. More engines, more shouting. This wasn't a fight. This was a full-on war. His radio crackled. "Jake!" It was Howard. "They're moving toward the bank." Jake's blood went cold. That was where the townspeople were holed up. He turned, seeing another explosion near the diner. The bikers weren't just here to kill or burn. They were herding them, pushing everyone toward one spot. And Jack wasn't even here yet. Jake's grip tightened on his gun. He wasn't going to let them take this town. Not tonight. Not ever. He sprinted toward the bank. Shadow close at his side. The street was a battlefield. Broken glass, flickering fires, bodies of wounded riders groaning on the pavement. He barely noticed. Ahead, the bank's doors had been barricaded, but the riders weren't stopping. They were gearing up for something bigger. Viper stood at the front, barking orders. "Get the damn truck, we'll ram it down." Jake fired as he ran. The shot clipped one of the bikers in the leg, sending him sprawling. Viper turned, locking eyes with Jake. "Well, well," he sneered. "Look who's still breathing." Jake didn't slow down. He slammed into Viper full force, knocking them both to the ground. The impact jarred his ribs, but he ignored it, rolling onto his feet. Viper spat blood, grinning. "That all you got?" Jake didn't answer. He drove his fist into Viper's face, once, twice. The biker's head snapped back, but he laughed. "Damn, you're a mean son of a—" A gunshot rang out. Not from Jake, not from the riders. From inside the bank. Jake's stomach dropped. Viper grinned. "Guess that means they made it inside." Jake's vision tunneled. He slammed Viper's head into the pavement, knocking him out cold, and bolted for the doors. Shadow was already ahead of him, leaping over a broken barricade. Jake hit the doors hard, shoving his way in. The inside of the bank was a mess. Shelves overturned, papers scattered, a chair smashed against a desk, and in the center, a man on the ground, bleeding out. Melissa was huddled near the counter, wide-eyed, a gun shaking in her hands. Jake recognized the dead man, one of Jack's. He looked at Melissa, breathing hard. She had shot him. "Melissa," he said, keeping his voice steady, "put the gun down." Her hands shook harder. Jake took a step forward, hands open. "It's okay. You did what you had to." She blinked at him, still trembling, but she nodded. Slowly, she let go. He caught the gun before it hit the ground. Outside, the roar of bikes grew louder. Jake knew what that meant. Jack was coming. And this was just the beginning. Jake barely had time to process what had just happened before another explosion rocked the town. The shockwave rattled the bank's windows, sending a fresh wave of panic through the few townspeople huddled inside. He turned, heart hammering in his chest. They weren't done yet. Melissa was still frozen, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The gun Jake had taken from her felt heavier in his hand than it should have. He flicked the safety back on and slid it into his belt. "You did good," he told her, his voice firm but steady. "You're still breathing. That's what matters." She swallowed hard, nodding, but said nothing. Jake turned to the others. A few men, a couple of elderly folks. Their faces were tight with fear. Most of them weren't built for this, weren't ready for a fight. But that didn't mean they were going to roll over. Not anymore. A fresh round of engines roared outside, more of them. He moved fast, ducking low beneath the windows, peering through the cracks in the blinds. Down the street, a black semi-truck had pulled up. The kind used to haul freight, heavy and built for ramming through anything that got in its way. A couple of bikes flanked it, their riders standing beside them like sentinels, and in the center of it all stood Grim Jack. He was here. The bastard was here. He wasn't laughing this time. He wasn't wearing that smug, lazy smirk like he had back at the bank robbery. No, this time his face was cold. Jake knew that look. It was the look of a man about to make an example out of someone. Jack tilted his head, scanning the street like he was deciding what to burn next. A group of his men had taken positions near the bank, crouching behind parked motorcycles, armed with shotguns and pistols. One of them, a lanky guy with a patch that read Butch, was holding a goddamn grenade launcher. Jake's stomach twisted. They weren't here to play around anymore. He pulled back from the window, exhaling slowly. "All right," he said. "Here's the deal. We stay quiet. We stay low. We do not make ourselves targets. Sam," the old hardware store owner, swallowed hard. "What if they come in here?" Jake's jaw clenched. "Then we make damn sure they regret it." Another explosion went off, this time farther down the street. From the smell, Jake knew it was fuel burning. The gas station had been hit hard enough, but now they were burning out the last of the reserves. Jack was cutting off supplies, isolating the town. Jake grabbed his radio, flicking it on. "Howard, you there?" Static. He tried again. "Howard, Respond. Still nothing. A fresh wave of frustration surged through him. The attack on the radio tower had been deliberate. They wanted to cut off communication. If Howard was alive, he had no way to call for help. If he was dead, no, he wasn't dead, not yet. Jake turned back to the others. Stay here, lock the doors. If I don't come back, you keep your heads down and you wait for an opening. Sam shook his head. You can't go out there alone. Jake checked his ammo. One full magazine, another half spent. He still had the shotgun in the back of his truck, but there was no way to reach it without getting cut down. I won't be alone. Shadow stood at his side, his body coiled like a spring ready to snap. Sam exhaled sharply, then nodded. All right. Jake moved toward the door, keeping low. The street outside was a goddamn war zone. Bikers were moving fast, torching businesses, smashing windows, setting everything ablaze, but something felt off. Jack wasn't just taking over, he wasn't looting, he was burning everything down. That wasn't how gangs worked, not if they wanted to own a place. And then it hit Jake. This wasn't about control anymore. Jack wasn't here to claim Red Gorge. He was here to wipe it off the damn map. Jake clenched his teeth, adrenaline surging through his veins. If that was the plan, then it meant one thing. This town had one shot to stop him, and it had to be tonight. He pushed open the door slowly, slipping into the night like a ghost. Shadow moved beside him, silent, his eyes locked on the bikers down the street. They stayed low, using the wreckage of a burned-out pickup truck for cover. Then, for the first time since this nightmare started, Jack spoke. His voice boomed over the chaos, cutting through the fire and gunshots like a blade. Red Gorge is done! Everything went still. Jake barely breathed. Jack took a slow step forward, boots crunching on glass. I know you're listening, Nolan, he called out, and I know you're watching. Jake stayed where he was, silent. Jack smiled. See, I could have taken this town clean, could have put a few bodies in the ground, made people afraid, run my operations without a hitch. But you, he pointed at the bank, you had to fight. He exhaled, shaking his head. So now I'm gonna make sure there ain't a goddamn thing left for you to fight for. Jake's grip on his gun tightened. Jack turned to Butch, the lanky bastard with the grenade launcher. Light it up, Jack said. Jake didn't have time to think. He moved. His gun was up before he even realized what he was doing. He fired twice. The first bullet slammed into Butch's arm, making him stumble. The second hit center mass, dropping him before he could pull the trigger. Then the whole goddamn street exploded. Gunfire erupted from both sides, bullets slamming into cars, windows, brick. Shadow lunged, taking down one of the bikers before they could react. Jake ran, straight for Jack. The gang leader saw him coming, his smirk twisting into something feral. He drew a knife. Jake didn't stop. They collided like a goddamn train wreck, rolling across the pavement. Jack slashed. The blade bit into Jake's side, hot and sharp, but he ignored it. He drove an elbow into Jack's jaw, knocking him back. Jack laughed, spitting blood. You don't quit, do you? Jake panted, his fingers curling into a fist. Not when it comes to my town. Jack came at him again, but this time Jake was ready. He twisted, slamming Jack's own momentum against him, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Before he could recover, Shadow was there, snarling, teeth bared. Jack froze. For the first time that night, he looked afraid. Jake raised his gun, breathless. It's over. Jack's lips curled, but he didn't move. Behind them, the fight was still raging, but Jake didn't care, because this was the endgame. Jack held his hands up. All right, you got me. Jake didn't lower his gun. Call them off, Jake growled. Jack hesitated. Then he whistled. The bikers stopped. Jake didn't blink, because he knew this wasn't mercy. This was survival, and Jack had just lost. The fires still burned, casting an eerie orange glow over the wreckage of Red Gorge. Smoke curled in the air, mixing with the acrid scent of gasoline and the metallic bite of blood. The battle had slowed, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Jake stood over Grimjack, his gun locked onto the gang leader's chest, his breath coming in controlled, measured bursts. Every muscle in his body was tense, coiled like a spring ready to snap. Shadow remained by his side, a low, menacing growl rolling through his throat. Jack smirked up at him, spitting blood onto the pavement. "Well," he rasped, "that was fun." Jake didn't flinch. He could still hear the remnants of gunfire in the distance, the occasional yell from a wounded man. His town had been reduced to a battlefield, and Jack was still treating it like a goddamn game. "Call them off," Jake ordered. His voice was ice, no patience, no negotiation. Jack wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand. "Already did," he said lazily, tilting his head toward the rest of the Steel Riders. And sure enough, the remaining bikers were backing off, some dragging their injured along with them, others peeling out on their motorcycles, disappearing into the night. The town was battered, broken, but it wasn't theirs. Jack had lost. Jake exhaled slowly. His finger hovered over the trigger, his instincts screaming at him to end it here. Jack wouldn't stop. He would regroup, rebuild, and come back. Unless Jake made sure he never got the chance. Jack must have seen the flicker of hesitation in his eyes, because he let out a dry chuckle. "That's not your style, is it?" he mused. "You're the law, the good guy, the one who follows the rules." He leaned his head back against the asphalt, letting out a slow breath. "So go ahead, cuff me, take me in, see how long that lasts." Jake clenched his jaw. The worst part, Jack was right. He had been arrested before. He had walked free before. The system didn't hold men like him. A familiar voice crackled through Jake's radio, snapping him back. "Nolan!" Howard's voice came through, sharp and strained. "We've got a situation at the station. You need to get here, now." Jake's grip tightened. He didn't look away from Jack. "What is it?" A brief silence, then, "It's about Jack." Jake's stomach turned to ice. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" Jake ignored him, keeping the gun trained on him. "What about him?" Howard hesitated. Then his voice lowered. "We need to talk, and you're going to want to hear this before you decide what to do with him." Jake didn't like that at all. Jack must have picked up on the shift in his expression because his smirk deepened. "Well now," he murmured. "That's interesting." Jake cursed under his breath. He wasn't about to let Jack walk, but he needed answers, fast. He lowered the gun, just enough to reach for his cuffs. "You're coming with me," he said, yanking Jack up onto his knees. Jack laughed, but there was something sharp in his eyes now, something calculating. "Lead the way, officer." Jake had a feeling he wasn't going to like where this was heading. By the time they reached the Red Gorge police station, the place was barely holding together. The front windows had been shattered. The sign out front had bullet holes riddled through it, and 2 patrol cars were still smoking from the earlier attack. Inside, the station was a mess. The few remaining officers were tending to wounded civilians, handcuffing the bikers they had managed to subdue. It looked less like a precinct and more like a triage unit. Howard was waiting just inside, his face grim. He barely glanced at Jack before motioning Jake toward his office. "We need to talk, now." Jake shoved Jack forward. "He goes in a cell first." Howard nodded toward the back. "Lock him up, then hurry." Jack smirked as Jake pushed him toward the holding cells, a familiar swagger in his step, like he wasn't handcuffed at all. "I'll save you a seat, officer." Jake ignored him, shoving him inside and slamming the door shut. Then he turned and stormed into Howard's office. Howard was already pouring himself a drink. "You're gonna want one of these." "I want answers," Jake snapped. Howard sighed, rubbing his temples. "You ever wonder how a guy like Jack gets out of every damn arrest, how he keeps slipping through the cracks?" Jake folded his arms. "Yeah, and?" Howard pulled a folder from his desk, a thick one. It had a federal seal on the front. Jake frowned. "What the hell is that?" Howard tossed it onto the desk. "Jack wasn't always a biker. He wasn't always a criminal." Jake didn't move. Howard exhaled sharply. "He was military." Jake blinked. His entire body went still. Howard tapped the folder. "Special Forces, explosives expert, dishonorably discharged." The words hit like a gunshot. Jake's mouth was dry. "He was a soldier. Not just any soldier," Howard muttered. "Black ops, off-the-books stuff. The kind of guy they trained to do bad things in the name of the country." Jake clenched his jaw. He knew those men. He had served with those men. They were trained to survive at any cost. Howard flipped open the file. He got kicked out after a mission went south, way south. Details are classified, but what we do know is this. He didn't just go rogue, he was abandoned. Jake swallowed hard. By who? Howard met his eyes. By the same government that trained him. Jake's stomach tightened. Everything clicked. Jack wasn't just a criminal. He was someone who had been turned into a weapon and then discarded. That's why he was so damn good at what he did. That's why he was untouchable. Jake took a slow breath. That doesn't excuse what he's done. Howard nodded. No, it doesn't. But it explains why he's always one step ahead. Why he doesn't just rob places. He destroys them. He tapped the file. This isn't about money, Jake. It's about revenge. Jake's fingers curled into fists. Jack wasn't here to take over Red Gorge. He was here to bury it. Howard sighed. And now you know why I called you in before you pulled that trigger. Jake didn't answer. His mind was moving too fast. Calculating. Processing. Jack had called in reinforcements before. If he had more ex-military on his side, this wasn't over. Not even close. Jake exhaled sharply. We need to finish this. Howard nodded. Yeah, we do. Outside, through the cracked window, the last of the fires in Red Gorge burned. Jack was in a cell. But for how long? And worse, what would happen when he got out? The town of Red Gorge was still smoldering when Jake left the station. The fires were dying, but the scars would remain. He could still smell the burned-out husk of Jerry's bar, still see the shattered windows and broken storefronts along Main Street. The town had fought back, but it had paid the price, and it wasn't over. Jack was sitting in a cell, but Jake knew that wouldn't last. A man like him didn't just go down quietly. He had people on the outside, contacts, loose ends he would tie up the moment he was free, which meant Jake had to get ahead of him. That's why he was out here, in the cold desert air, tracking the last remaining bikers who had disappeared after the attack, the ones who had slipped away when things turned south. He needed to find them, and Shadow was going to help him do it. Jake crouched beside his truck, gripping Shadow's harness. The dog was already tense, ears forward, nose twitching. He'd caught a scent, something lingering from the fight, something that didn't belong to the town. Find them, Jake murmured. Shadow let out a low chuff and started moving, silent as a ghost. Jake followed, one hand on his sidearm, his boots crunching lightly on the dirt road leading out of town. They were heading east, toward the back roads that twisted through the desert. That was where the last of the steel riders had fled. And if Jake was right, they were regrouping. They weren't done. Not yet. The tracks led away from the main highway, veering off onto a barely visible path, marked only by deep tire ruts and scattered boot prints. It was a smart move. Avoiding paved roads meant fewer chances of getting spotted by law enforcement. Jake stayed close behind Shadow, his breath steady despite the cold settling in his lungs. The desert at night was silent, the kind of quiet that made you feel exposed, vulnerable, which meant whoever was out here, they could hear him coming. Shadow suddenly stopped, his body going stiff, his nose lifted slightly, testing the air. Jake crouched low, one hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. Shadow's growl was barely audible, but Jake understood what it meant. They weren't alone. A flicker of movement in the distance. A shadow shifting near a cluster of boulders. Jake exhaled slowly. He stayed still, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. The desert wasn't completely black. There was just enough moonlight to catch outlines, shapes, the faint shimmer of metal. A motorcycle, half hidden behind the rocks. Jake's pulse ticked up. Someone was here, watching, waiting. Shadow growled again, lower this time, controlled. He was holding back, waiting for the command. Jake lifted a hand. Hold. He moved forward carefully, his boots light on the dirt, his breath slow and even. The closer he got, the clearer the scene became. 2 bikes. 2. A campfire burned low to embers. A figure hunched near it, their back to Jake. He tightened his grip on his weapon. 1 man. But where was the other? Shadow's body shifted, his ears flicking towards something behind them. Too late. The barrel of a shotgun pressed against Jake's back. Well, well, a voice drawled. Look what the dog dragged in. Jake didn't move. He knew that voice. Tank. The big bastard had survived the bank fight, the street battle, and now he had the drop on him. Jake slowly raised his hands. "Was wondering when we'd run into each other again," he said evenly. Tank chuckled, the sound rough. "Yeah, I wasn't. Figured you'd be dead by now." Jake glanced at Shadow out of the corner of his eye. The dog was still, waiting. Tank shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. "You come out here all alone, Nolan?" Jake kept his breathing steady. "Something like that." "You got balls, I'll give you that," Tank muttered. "But you ain't got brains, 'cause now," the cold press of the barrel pushed harder against his spine, "now you're just a dead man." Jake exhaled sharply. "You sure about that?" Tank hesitated. "Just a second," and that was enough. Jake moved. He spun, his left hand slamming the shotgun barrel away just as Shadow lunged. The dog hit Tank hard, jaws clamping onto his arm, dragging him down. The shotgun went off, a wild blast that tore through the empty air where Jake had been standing a second earlier. Tank screamed, trying to shake Shadow off, but the dog was locked in, his teeth buried deep. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gun and fired. 1, 2. The bullet slammed into Tank's chest, knocking him flat onto the dirt. His breath rattled as he coughed, blood spilling from his lips. Shadow let go, stepping back, his muzzle slick with blood. Tank wheezed, his eyes flickering. "You think this stops him?" Jake holstered his weapon, crouching beside him. "Jack's in a cell," he said. "Your crew is scattered. You're bleeding out in the middle of the desert. It's over." Tank chuckled weakly. "Nah, you don't get it." He swallowed hard, his voice fading. "Jack, he's just getting started." His head lolled to the side. Jake checked his pulse. Gone. He exhaled slowly, standing. He looked toward the other biker, the one by the fire. The guy hadn't moved. Jake strode over, gun raised, kicking him onto his back. The man was already dead, a bullet hole through his forehead. Shot execution style. Jake frowned, scanning the area. Something wasn't right. He glanced at the fire again. The ashes weren't disturbed. This wasn't a hiding spot. It was a message, and then Jake saw it. A radio. Sitting on one of the boulders, the red light was blinking. It had been recording everything. Jake's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an ambush, it was bait. And whoever had set it up, they were still listening. He snatched the radio, his jaw tightening. He clicked the button, raising it to his lips. "Who the hell are you?" Silence. Then after a long pause, a familiar voice crackled through, low, smooth, amused. "Miss me, officer?" Jake's heart stopped. "Jack," from inside the goddamn cell. The line cut out. Jake stood there, the radio still in his hand, the wind whistling through the rocks. He knew what this meant. Jack was playing him. And worse, he was still in control. Jake exhaled slowly, his fingers curled into a fist. This wasn't just a war, it was personal now, and Jack had just made his biggest mistake yet. The desert wind howled through the night as Jake stood frozen, the radio still clutched in his hand. Jack's voice echoed in his ears, taunting, confident. He was still in control, even from a goddamn cell. Jake's pulse thudded heavy in his ears as his mind raced. Jack had known. He had known Jake would come out here. Known he'd track the stragglers, known he'd find the bodies. It was a trap, not one meant to kill him, one meant to send a message. Jack was playing him, and worse, he was still 2 steps ahead. Jake exhaled sharply, forcing himself to move. He tossed the radio onto the dead biker's chest and turned to Shadow, who was still tense, ears flicking toward the darkness beyond the rocks. He could feel it too, the weight of something unfinished. They had to get back to town. Now, Jake knelt, running a hand along Shadow's back, grounding himself. "Let's go, boy." Shadow hesitated for only a second before falling into step beside him. His body pressed close to Jake's leg as they moved back toward the truck. Every shadow, every flicker of movement felt like a potential threat. Because if Jack had planned this, if he had wanted Jake out here, then something was happening back in Red Gorge. Something worse. Jake reached the truck in under 3 minutes, yanking the door open and pulling himself inside. Shadow leapt into the passenger seat just as Jake slammed the door shut. He fired up the ignition, tires kicking up a spray of dirt as he turned the truck around, gunning it back toward town. He grabbed his radio, flipping it to the station's frequency. "Howard, come in." Static. Jake gritted his teeth. "Howard, talk to me." Still nothing. His fingers clenched around the wheel. God damn it. The highway back to town stretched before him, a long strip of asphalt cutting through the desert, lit only by his headlights and the occasional flicker of distant flames still smoldering in the wreckage of the Steel Riders' attack. But something was wrong. The town wasn't just dark, it was blacked out completely. Jake's chest tightened. They had cut the power, the station, the emergency services, everything. His headlights hit the edge of town, sweeping over the devastation left behind. Burned-out cars, broken windows, flickering embers in the skeleton of what had once been Jerry's bar. And in the middle of it, a convoy of black SUVs, parked just outside the police station. Jake's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the Steel Riders. This was something else. He killed the truck's lights, coasting the last 100 yards into an alley between two wrecked buildings. He shut off the engine and reached for his gun, his mind spinning. Jack was in the station, and now so were these guys. Jake had seen enough in his years to recognize the pattern. This wasn't some last-minute gang rescue attempt. This was organized, deliberate, professional. And that meant Jack had just called in reinforcements. Jake eased out of the truck, Shadow slipping out beside him. The dog's muscles were tight, his stance low, waiting for the command. They moved fast, cutting through the shadows, keeping close to the buildings. Jake's eyes scanned the street, searching for movement. The station's front doors were wide open. A bad sign. Jake pulled up against the side of the building, pressing close to the brick as he listened. Inside, voices, multiple, deep, calm, controlled, not bikers, something worse. Jake crept to the nearest window, keeping low as he peered inside, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Jack was out of his cell, standing in the middle of the room, hands uncuffed, smiling like a man who had just won the lottery. Across from him, 6 men in tactical gear, black fatigues, body armor, suppressed rifles slung over their shoulders. They weren't police. They weren't gangsters. They were mercenaries, hired guns, and they had come for him. Jake clenched his jaw so hard it ached. Howard was slumped against a desk, his face bloody, breathing heavy. Another deputy, Martinez, was zip-tied to a chair, his eyes swollen shut. Jack was laughing, shaking hands with one of the mercs. Like this had been the plan all along. Jake barely breathed. Jack's voice carried through the broken station, smooth as ever. "Right on time," he said. "I was starting to think I'd have to break myself out." The lead mercenary, a man with a scar running down his jaw, shook his head. "We don't leave loose ends." His voice was cold, efficient. "Your boys handled the town well enough, but the cop's still breathing. That's a problem," Jack chuckled. "Yeah, that one's a pain in the ass." Jake didn't move. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He had one shot to make this right, and he wasn't going to waste it. He leaned down, whispering in Shadow's ear. The dog didn't hesitate. He slipped into the shadows, disappearing through the back entrance like a ghost. Jake waited. 1 second, 2. Jack took a step forward, adjusting his leather vest. "So, what's the plan?" he asked. "You boys taking me with you, or am I running the next part solo?" Scarjaw Merc didn't smile. "We're tying up loose ends first," his rifle raised. Jake moved. He came through the window fast, gun up before anyone had a chance to react. His first shot took out the nearest merc, dropping him instantly. The room erupted into chaos. Jack spun, eyes wide, caught off guard. Scarjaw dove for cover, barking orders. But it was too late. Shadow launched from the dark, tackling one of the mercs, his teeth sinking deep into the man's arm. The guy screamed, twisting as he fell. Jake took the opening, his second shot punching through another merc's vest, sending him crashing into a desk. Jack was already moving, grabbing a pistol off the table, eyes burning. He fired once, twice, but Jake was already diving behind cover. The bullets shattered glass, ripped through paperwork. Howard groaned from his chair, struggling to sit up. The last two mercs were scrambling, trying to get a clean shot. Jake popped up, fired again, one down. Shadow took care of the last, and then it was just Jack. Jake turned, gun locked onto him. Jack stood in the center of the room, gun in hand, breathing heavy. For the first time, the smugness was gone. "You're running out of people," Jake said, voice steady. Jack exhaled, then smiled. "Yeah," he muttered. "But so are you." A screech of tires outside. Jake's heart stopped. Jack grinned wider. Reinforcements. Jake barely had time to process before the first shots rang out. And all hell broke loose. Gunfire tore through the station windows, sending glass raining down in a deadly cascade. The bullets punched through walls, cabinets, and desks, shredding everything in their path. Jake dove behind the nearest overturned table, his heart hammering as the station erupted into chaos. Shadow darted low, weaving between the desks, avoiding the hail of bullets like a ghost. His instincts were razor-sharp, his body coiled for another attack, but he waited. He needed Jake's command. Outside, the mercenaries' reinforcements had arrived. More SUVs, more gunmen. Jake risked a glance through the broken window. 6 more men spilling out of the vehicles, armed to the teeth. Shit. Jack was still standing in the center of the station, gun in hand, grinning like a lunatic. "Well, officer," he called over the gunfire, "looks like you're out of time." Jake's jaw clenched. Not yet. He fired twice, forcing Jack to dive for cover. He barely made it, rolling behind the remnants of Howard's desk as bullets whizzed past his head. Howard groaned from his chair, still tied up. He was badly injured, but he wasn't out. His one good eye locked onto Jake, the other swollen shut. "They came prepared," he rasped. Jake fired again, forcing one of the gunmen outside to duck behind an SUV. "So did we." Howard let out a dry chuckle, but it turned into a cough. Jake's mind was working overtime. The mercs had surrounded the station. The front entrance was a kill zone. The windows were compromised, and the only other exit was the back door, which led straight into an alley they were probably covering. This wasn't a firefight. It was a goddamn execution. Jack's escape plan had arrived, and they weren't leaving anyone behind. Jake's radio crackled with static. Then a familiar voice cut through. "Martinez." "Nolan, you still breathing?" Jake clicked his mic. "Barely." "We're holed up at Miller's fuel stop," Martinez said. "Got a few rifles, some locals willing to fight, but we need to know what the hell's going on." Jake exhaled. Good they weren't alone. "The station's under siege," Jake said. "Jack's out of his cell, got 6 mercs inside with him, and more just pulled up." Martinez swore under his breath. "How many?" 6 outside. Maybe more coming." A brief pause. Then, "We're coming to you." Jake shook his head, even though Martinez couldn't see him. "Negative. Too many shooters. They'll cut you down before you get close." Another pause, then slowly, "So what's the play?" Jake glanced at Jack, who was reloading behind his cover, smirking to himself like he was already celebrating. And then, just like that, Jake knew. The plan clicked into place. It was stupid, it was reckless, and it was the only way out. He tapped the radio again. "Martinez, listen carefully. Get your people to the ridge west of the station. You know the old fire break? Yeah. Set up there. Bring everything you got. When you hear an explosion, that's your cue. Light them up." Martinez hesitated. "Explosion." Jake didn't answer. He cut the radio, turning instead to Howard. "You still got explosives in the armory?" Howard blinked through the pane. "Yeah. Some dynamite left over from a construction job last year." "Why?" Jake pulled back the empty magazine from his gun, reloading. "Because we're about to blow the hell out of this place." Howard let out a pained chuckle. "Thought you were a cop, Nolan." Jake's eyes were cold. "Right now, I'm a survivor." Howard nodded once. "Go." Jake moved fast. He had seconds, maybe a minute before the mercs breached the entrance. He whistled low, and Shadow bolted after him, disappearing down the hallway. They reached the armory door, a reinforced steel panel that had taken a few bullets but was still holding strong. Jake fumbled with the keys on his belt, hands slick with sweat, his pulse pounding. Finally he found the right one. shoving it into the lock. The door swung open. Inside, the dynamite. Jake grabbed 3 sticks, along with a detonation cord and a remote trigger. He worked fast, wrapping the explosives together, his fingers moving purely on muscle memory. Jack had no idea what was coming. A fresh wave of gunfire erupted from the front of the station. They were moving in. Jake didn't have time to set a traditional charge. He had to make it fast, ugly. He grabbed a gasoline can from the shelf, dousing the hallway floor leading back to the main lobby. Then he placed the explosives right in the middle of it. It was crude. It was insane, but it would work. He clicked his radio. "Martinez, get ready." No hesitation this time. "Copy that." Jake turned, locking eyes with Shadow. "We're getting out of here. Stay close." The dog whined low, understanding. Jake grabbed his gun, took a deep breath, then kicked open the armory door. Bullets ripped through the hallway, sparking off the metal walls. Jake rolled low, coming up firing. One merc went down instantly, clutching his leg as he hit the floor. Another staggered, caught in the shoulder. Jack was already moving, sprinting toward the back exit. Jake fired twice, but Jack was fast. He dove over a desk, disappearing behind a row of filing cabinets. Shadow lunged, taking down the merc, still standing. The last gunman in the room tried to run. Jake didn't let him. One shot, center mass. He hit the ground hard. Jack's voice rang out from the back. "You really gonna blow up your own station, Nolan?" Jake was already running. He reached the back hallway, catching sight of Jack just as he reached the door. Jake aimed. Jack twisted, firing first. The bullet slammed into Jake's vest, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, gasping, but didn't go down. Jack hesitated just for a second. Jake fired. The bullet clipped Jack's leg, sending him crashing through the back door. Jake didn't chase him. Instead, he raised the detonator. Jack looked back, eyes wild, realizing too late. Jake pressed the button. The explosion ripped through the station, the shockwave tearing through the walls, blowing out windows, sending flames roaring into the sky. Jack was thrown forward by the force, hitting the pavement hard. Jake staggered, his ears ringing, the heat scorching his skin. Then, gunfire from the ridge. Martinez and his people had opened fire. The mercs were trapped, and just like that, the tide had turned. Jack was still moving, crawling, coughing, trying to get up. Jake walked toward him, gun raised. Jack looked up, grinning through bloody teeth. "You really don't quit, do you?" Jake's voice was steel. "Not until you're done." Jack's grin faltered. For the first time, he looked afraid. And Jake was just getting started. Smoke curled through the night, mixing with the scent of scorched asphalt, burning wood, and spilled gasoline. The Red Gorge police station was gone. Nothing but a ruined shell smoldering behind Jake. The explosion had done its job, wiping out the last of the mercenary reinforcements and turning the battlefield in their favor. But it wasn't over. Jack was still breathing. Jake stood over him, gun steady, finger curled against the trigger. Jack's body was a mess, his leather vest torn, his shirt stained with blood and soot. His right leg was twisted awkwardly beneath him, where Jake's bullet had torn through his thigh. His lips were split, his left eye swelling shut, but somehow the bastard was still grinning. "You should have killed me with that explosion," Jack muttered, coughing up blood. "Would have been cleaner." Jake didn't say anything. His lungs burned from the smoke, his ribs ached from the bullet he'd taken to the vest, but his hands were steady. Jack let out a breathy chuckle. "So what's the plan now? Officer, you gonna put me back in a cell? You really think that's gonna hold me?" Jake exhaled slowly through his nose. He wanted to put a bullet between Jack's eyes. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to do it. Jack had burned this town. He had murdered people, terrorized families, brought hell to Red Gorge, and he was still playing games, still treating this like it was some kind of sport. But Jake wasn't a killer, and Jack knew that. "That's what I thought," Jack rasped. He shifted, wincing as his wounded leg protested. "Guys like me, we don't go away, Nolan. You can put me in cuffs, you can lock me up, but the system ain't built for men like me. You know it. I know it." His lips curled. So maybe, just this once, you break the rules. Jake's grip on his gun tightened. Shadow paced beside him, his golden eyes locked onto Jack, muscles twitching with the urge to finish what they had started. Jack saw the hesitation and let out another ragged laugh. That's the difference between us, man. You play by their rules. I don't. That's why I win. Jake took a slow step closer, his voice low. You didn't win, Jack. Jack's smirk faltered. You lost your crew, Jake continued. You lost your town. And now you're lying in the dirt, waiting for someone else to save you. That's not winning. Jack's jaw clenched. For the first time since this whole damn thing started, the confidence in his eyes flickered. Just a little. Jake wasn't sure what made him do it, but he lowered his gun slightly. Not completely, but enough to make his point. You think you're untouchable, Jake said. But I want you to really think about something. Jack's good eye narrowed. Jake leaned in just a little, his voice ice cold. Where are they now? Jack's breath hitched. Jake didn't move, didn't blink. You've spent your whole life making people fear you, but fear doesn't last. The second things went bad, your own men abandoned you, and the ones who stayed, they're dead. You think you won? Jake shook his head. You're alone, Jack. Jack swallowed hard. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant crackle of flames and the occasional gunshot from the last few bikers being rounded up by the locals. Then finally, Jack exhaled. His grin was gone. All right, cop, he muttered, his voice quieter now. Do what you gotta do. Jake took a step back. You're done, Jack. Jack didn't argue. For the first time, he looked like he believed it. Jake grabbed his radio, clicking it on. Martinez, I got him. Static crackled for a second before Martinez's voice came through, breathless. Alive. Yeah, Jake said. Get Howard over here. We're bringing this bastard in. Martinez let out a breath. Copy that. Jake clipped the radio back to his belt and looked down at Jack. His expression was unreadable. Jack just smirked weakly. Guess I finally ran out of luck. Jake didn't answer. For now, it was over, but in the back of his mind, he knew Jack might be locked up. But men like him never stayed down for long, and Red Gorge would never be the same. The next few hours were a blur. The last of the Steel Riders were rounded up, the mercs that had survived were taken into custody, and the fires were put out before they could finish what Jack had started. Howard was banged up but alive, thanks to Martinez and the townsfolk who had stepped up in the fight. The people of Red Gorge had stood their ground, and it had cost them, but they had won. Jake sat on the hood of his truck, watching as the sun finally started to rise over the horizon. Shadow lay beside him, tail flicking lazily, his golden eyes half-lidded but alert. They had done it, but at what cost? Jake glanced down the street. The bar was gone. Half the storefronts on Main Street were damaged or burned out. The police station, a smoldering ruin. This wasn't just about the fight. Jack had wanted to break this town, and in a way he had. Jake exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand down his face. He was covered in dust, sweat, and dried blood. His ribs ached, his shoulder burned, and his body was exhausted. But it wasn't over, not really. Martinez walked up beside him, crossing his arms. Hell of a night, he muttered. Jake let out a dry chuckle. That's one way to put it. Martinez shook his head, glancing toward the remains of the police station. What now? Jake didn't answer right away. He thought about it. What now? The town would rebuild. They had to. The people of Red Gorge were fighters, and they weren't going to let Jack's destruction be the final chapter of their town's history. But Jake knew this wasn't the end. Jack would be locked up, for now. But he had connections. If the past had taught Jake anything, it was that men like Jack had a way of slipping through the cracks. And if that happened, Jake would be waiting. Finally, he exhaled and pushed himself off the truck. Now, he muttered, patting Shadow's head, we clean up the mess. Martinez smirked. That's going to take a while. Jake looked out at the town, at the people already picking up the pieces, helping each other, making plans. Yeah, Jake said, but we'll get there. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he actually believed it. The sun was fully up by the time the dust had settled. Red Gorge stood battered, bruised, but still standing. The fires had burned out, leaving behind the skeletal remains of buildings that had once been the heartbeat of the town. Jerry's bar was gone, nothing but blackened wood and shattered glass. The police station was a hollow shell, smoke still curling from the rubble. The diner had barely survived, its windows shattered, its sign half hanging from twisted metal brackets. But the town was alive, and that was what mattered. That was what. Jake stood in the middle of Main Street, the heat already creeping in as the morning light spilled across the wreckage. Shadow sat beside him, tongue hanging out slightly, his body still tense despite the calm that had settled over the ruins. It had been a long night, a brutal night, but they had made it. Behind him, Martinez was directing some of the remaining deputies, securing the prisoners that hadn't been gunned down in the firefight. The Steel Riders were in chains now. What was left of them anyway? The mercenaries who had survived were being loaded into vehicles, their fate uncertain, but Jake didn't care what happened to them. Jack had been taken in first, shoved into the back of a squad car with his hands zip-tied behind him. He hadn't fought, he hadn't struggled, he had laughed. That was what unsettled Jake the most. Jack wasn't a man who feared consequences. He was a man who expected to walk free. Jake knew what that meant. This wasn't over. Howard walked up beside him, a fresh bandage wrapped around his forehead, his shirt stained with blood that wasn't entirely his own. He looked rough, but alive. "You all right?" Howard muttered. Jake didn't take his eyes off the town. "I'll let you know when I figure that out." Howard sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Damn mess, huh?" Jake let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Hell of a mess." They stood in silence for a moment, just taking it in. The town had fought back. The people had refused to roll over, refused to let Jack take everything from them. They had suffered for it, but they had won. Howard let out a grunt, looking over at the wreckage of the police station. "Gonna be a bitch rebuilding all this." Jake nodded. "Yeah, but we'll do it." Howard smirked. "Since when did you become so optimistic?" Jake exhaled slowly, scratching Shadow behind the ears. The dog closed his eyes briefly, soaking in the touch, his body still humming with energy from the fight. "We made it through the night," Jake said. "That's got to count for something." Howard nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." More townspeople had started gathering, stepping out from their homes, their makeshift shelters, looking around at what was left of their town. Some carried buckets of water to douse the last embers, others grabbed tools to clear debris. The community had taken a hit, but it wasn't broken. Red Gorge wasn't done yet. Jerry, the old bar owner, walked over, his face dark with soot. His hands scraped raw from pulling wreckage apart. His bar was gone, but he didn't look defeated. He looked determined. "Don't suppose we're getting federal aid for this?" Jerry muttered, looking around. Howard snorted. "You expecting FEMA to give a damn about a town this small?" Jerry huffed. "Figures." He spat onto the ground, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Guess we'll do it the old-fashioned way." Martinez walked over, shaking his head. "We got enough bodies to help rebuild, but we're short on supplies. No telling how long it's going to take to get this town back on its feet." Jake nodded. "Then we don't wait for help." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "You got a plan?" Jake glanced around. "We start small. The diner's still standing mostly. We use it as a base of operations. Get food and water running through town first, then worry about rebuilding the rest." Howard rubbed his chin. "What about law enforcement? We don't even have a damn building left." Jake exhaled, glancing at the wreckage of the station. "We don't need a building to keep people safe." He looked at the deputies. The townsfolk still armed, still ready. "We'll figure it out. They'll expect us to fall apart now. We don't." Martinez nodded. "All right, I'll spread the word." Jake turned back to Jerry. "Think you can set up an emergency meeting at the diner?" Jerry gave a rough laugh. "You're putting me in charge of logistics," Jake smirked. "I'm putting you in charge of making sure nobody gives up. You're good at that." Jerry rolled his eyes, but his lips curled in something close to a smile. "Fine. But if this town gets sick of my voice, I'm blaming you." Howard chuckled. They were already sick of your voice before this. Jerry flipped him off and stalked toward the diner. Jake ran a hand down his face. His body ached. His ribs were sore, his shoulder burned, and exhaustion was starting to creep in. But there was no time to rest. Not yet. Howard nudged him. So what about him? Jake followed his gaze to where Jack was sitting in the back of a squad car, his hands still bound, staring out at the town like he was memorizing every face. Jake's stomach tightened. Jack wasn't done. Even locked up, even beaten, he still had something up his sleeve. Jake stepped forward, walking over to the car. Jack turned his head slightly, grinning. "Come to say goodbye?" Jack asked. Jake's jaw clenched. "You're not walking away from this one," Jack hummed. "You sure?" Jake stared him down. "Yeah, I'm sure." Jack let out a slow breath, stretching his shoulders. "You ever wonder, Nolan, what happens when the fight's over, when the adrenaline runs out?" Jake didn't answer. Jack's smile widened. "You don't think they'll turn on you? Eventually, the people you saved." He tilted his head. "Fear's a funny thing, you know. It fades, and when it does, people start asking questions." Jake leaned closer, his voice quiet, dangerous. "The only thing people are asking is how long you'll rot in a cell before someone shanks you." Jack chuckled. "Fair enough." Jake exhaled sharply. "Get him the hell out of here." Martinez and 2 deputies loaded Jack into the transport vehicle. As the doors slammed shut, Jake watched the last of the Steel Riders' reign over Red Gorge come to an end. For now. Howard walked up beside him, hands on his hips. "You think this town will ever go back to normal?" Jake scanned the faces around him, tired, bruised, but determined. "It already is." Howard chuckled. "Guess we'll see." Jake gave one last look at the wreckage. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows over the town. The fight was over, but Red Gorge, it wasn't going anywhere, and neither was he. The days after the battle for Red Gorge were a blur of exhaustion and rebuilding. The town had taken its hardest hit in decades, but it hadn't fallen. The fires had been put out, the dead had been buried, and the wreckage was being cleared piece by piece. But the scars, those would take longer to heal. Jake walked down what remained of Main Street, Shadow at his side, surveying the damage. The town was alive with activity, locals hauling debris, hammering boards over broken windows, working together like they had nothing left to lose, because that's what Red Gorge was, a town that refused to die. The police station was gone, just a smoldering ruin where the explosion had ripped through its foundation. For now, Howard had set up a temporary office in the community center, working out of a borrowed folding desk and a radio on a plastic table. The sheriff was handling logistics, coordinating what little resources they had left to keep the town together. And somehow, through all of it, the people didn't complain. They weren't waiting for outside help. They weren't looking for an easy way out. They were rebuilding their home themselves. Jake had always respected this town, but now he was damn proud of it. "Morning, Nolan," a voice called out. He turned to see Jerry, standing outside what was left of his bar, a cigarette hanging from his lips as he surveyed the damage. Most of the building was gone, just a blackened frame and piles of rubble. But instead of despair, there was something else in his eyes, determination. "Morning," Jake said. He eyed the wreckage. "How bad is it?" Jerry took a long drag, exhaled. "Ain't got a damn thing left but the bar stools." Jake nodded. "You thinking of rebuilding?" Jerry smirked. "Thinking? Hell, the foundation's already poured." He jerked his thumb toward a group of men unloading wood from the back of a pickup. "Can't let the riders be the ones who decide when we close shop, right?" Jake allowed himself a small smile. "Guess not." Jerry flicked his cigarette into the dirt and crossed his arms. "Heard you're getting a medal or something." Jake sighed. "It's not a medal." Jerry raised an eyebrow. "A plaque." Then Jake shook his head. "More like a damn formality. The mayor's bringing in some state officials for a ceremony. Probably just a photo op." Jerry chuckled. "Still, town owes you." Jake looked around, watching the people moving through the streets, working together, surviving. "They don't owe me anything," he said. Jerry didn't argue, because he knew Jake meant it. The ceremony took place in what was left of the town square. right in front of the old courthouse. Someone had set up a podium, and a handful of folding chairs had been dragged in from the community center. The Arizona State Police chief had driven in, along with a few officials, all of them eager to shake hands and get their pictures taken with the hero of Red Gorge. Jake hated every second of it. He stood off to the side, arms crossed, waiting for this whole thing to be over. Howard nudged him. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." "I would." Howard smirked. "Too bad." The mayor, a wiry old man named Clarence Hill, took the stage first. He was wearing a suit that looked like it hadn't been used in 20 years, clearing his throat as he adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, "we are gathered here today to recognize the bravery and resilience of our town in the face of unthinkable violence. Red Gorge was tested, pushed to the edge, and yet we stood tall." Applause. Jake sighed. Clarence continued. "Many of us fought that night. Many of us bled for this town. But there is one man in particular who stood at the front lines, who fought not just with a badge but with his heart." Jake winced. Clarence smiled. "Officer Jake Nolan." More applause. Jake barely held back a groan as Howard gave him a shove toward the podium. He walked up, shadow padding beside him, stopping at his heel. Clarence turned, holding out a plaque, his name engraved in cheap brass, the words "For Bravery" in defense of Red Gorge written beneath it. Jake took it with a nod, shook the mayor's hand. More pictures, more forced smiles. Then Clarence stepped aside, motioning for him to speak. Jake cleared his throat, glancing at the crowd. They were all watching him, waiting. He exhaled, then leaned forward slightly. "I appreciate this," he started. Lifting the plaque slightly. "But this isn't just about me." A beat of silence. "This town fought," he continued. "Every single person here. You didn't run. You didn't break. You stood your ground." His gaze moved over the crowd, landing on the shopkeepers, the farmers, the locals, who had stood in the streets and fought back when no one else would. "I don't care about this plaque," Jake said. "I care about what we did together. We didn't just survive that night. We showed them what happens when they come after the wrong town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Jake straightened. "Red Gorge isn't just some pit stop in the desert. It's our home, and no matter who comes through next, this town will always stand." Applause, real applause this time. Jake nodded once, stepping away. Howard smirked as he walked back over. "Not bad," Jake scoffed. "You'd think they'd at least give me a free coffee for all this?" Howard chuckled. "I'll talk to the diner." The ceremony wrapped up quickly after that. The officials shook hands, took more pictures, then packed up and left. The town, it went back to work, because that's what Red Gorge did. Jake stood near his truck, watching as people started rebuilding again, determined to put the past behind them. He exhaled slowly. The fight was over. For now. Shadow nudged his leg, looking up at him expectantly. Jake scratched behind his ears, smirking. Yeah, you probably deserve a medal too, huh?" The dog wagged his tail. Howard walked up, hands in his pockets. "What's next for you?" Jake shrugged. "Same as before." Howard raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Jake nodded toward the town. "This place still needs a cop." Howard smiled slightly. "That it does." Jake glanced down the street one last time. The town wasn't whole yet. It would take time, but it was alive, and that was enough, for now. The sun hung low over Red Gorge, casting long shadows across the wreckage left behind. The town had survived, but it wasn't the same. It never would be. Jake knew that, and so did the people. The streets, once filled with the distant hum of normalcy, were now occupied by workers repairing what had been lost. The hardware store had reopened, but half its inventory had been stolen or burned. The gas station was still standing, but the pumps had been sabotaged, leaving the town cut off from fuel shipments. The worst of it, Jerry's bar, gone, reduced to rubble and ash. But Red Gorge wasn't dead. It was rebuilding, one board, one nail, one broken window at a time. Jake stood outside the temporary sheriff's office, which had been relocated to the old community center. It was the only building left with enough space to operate as a command post. He wasn't wearing his uniform. His badge was still on his belt, but he felt like it carried less weight now. Because the truth was, This town wasn't protected by the badge. It was protected by its people. Shadow sat at his feet, panting lightly, his ears twitching at every passing sound. Even after the fight, the dog was still on guard, like he knew something wasn't finished. And maybe he was right. Jake exhaled, stepping inside. The community center smelled like dust and old wood. The faint scent of coffee lingering from the makeshift break room that had been set up in the back. Howard was already there, leaning over a table covered in maps, case files, and reports. He looked up as Jake walked in, nodding toward a chair. "Glad you're here," Howard said. "We got a situation." Jake sat down. "Tell me." Howard pushed a file toward him. Jake flipped it open and frowned. A mugshot stared back at him. Not Jack, but Viper. One of the last remaining Steel Riders who hadn't been killed or hauled away with Jack. Jake's jaw clenched. "Where is he?" Howard sighed, rubbing his temples. "County's got him locked up. But he's talking." Jake narrowed his eyes. "Talking?" Howard nodded. "Says he wants a deal." Jake's lips pressed into a thin line. He hated that word. "What's he offering?" Howard hesitated. Then, finally, "Jack's network." Jake blinked. For a long moment, he just stared at Howard, trying to decide if this was some kind of joke. Howard wasn't laughing. "He's flipping?" Jake asked. Howard nodded. "Claims he's got details on every operation Jack ran, contacts, cash drops, safe houses, everything." Jake didn't buy it. Not yet. Viper had been Jack's second in command, one of his most loyal guys, the kind of man who didn't talk. And now, suddenly, he wanted to help. Something wasn't right. Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. And why, exactly, would he betray Jack? Howard exhaled slowly. "Says Jack left him for dead." Jake stayed silent. It wasn't impossible. Jack wasn't the kind of man who valued loyalty. He used people until they had nothing left to give, and when they were no longer useful, he discarded them. But still, Viper wasn't a victim. He had burned just as many places as Jack had. He had terrorized this town, and now he wanted to cut a deal. Jake clenched his jaw. "I want to talk to him," Howard smirked. "Figured you'd say that." He grabbed his keys. "Let's go." The county jail was 2 towns over, a concrete block of a building that had seen better days. Jake had been there a few times, mostly to drop off drunks and small-time criminals. But this time, this was different. The guard at the front desk led them through the halls, past rows of steel doors and heavy locks, until they reached the interrogation room. Inside, Viper sat shackled to a table, his wrists cuffed, his face bruised from the fight in Red Gorge. His trademark smirk was gone, replaced by something else, something Jake didn't expect. Fear. Jake stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He took his time walking to the table, letting the silence stretch, letting Viper feel it. Finally, he sat. Viper let out a slow breath. "You're not here to kill me, are you?" Jake tilted his head. "Should I be?" Viper let out a humorless chuckle. "Wouldn't blame you." Jake didn't say anything. Viper leaned forward slightly, his cuffed hands resting on the table. "You think I'm lying, that I'm just trying to save my own ass?" Jake did think that, but he didn't say it. Instead, he just stared, waiting. Viper exhaled sharply. "I was loyal to Jack for years, followed him through hell, never questioned it, never thought about what came next. But that night," he shook his head, "that was different." Jake watched him carefully. "How?" Viper met his gaze. "Jack didn't want to win. He wanted to destroy everything." His jaw tightened. "Even us." Jake didn't flinch. He had already suspected as much, but hearing it out loud, it made it real. Viper leaned back, looking tired. "He left me to die. Left all of us to die. And for what? Some kind of revenge." He scoffed. "That ain't loyalty. That's just suicide." Jake studied him. "So now you want to help?" Viper nodded. "I know where the rest of his guys are, the ones who didn't show up that night. They're still out there." Jake's stomach tightened. Of course they were. Jack had built something bigger than just the Steel Riders. He had connections, people who weren't in Red Gorge during the fight, but were still loyal to him. And now, with Jack locked up, those people were waiting. Jake exhaled slowly. "If you're lying to me..." Viper smirked, but there was no humor in it. I ain't lying, cop, 'cause I know what happens if Jack gets out. He won't just come for me. His eyes darkened. He'll come for all of us. Jake stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, finally, he stood. He turned to Howard. We take the deal. Howard nodded. Viper relaxed slightly. Smart move. Jake gave him a cold smile. We'll see, because this wasn't about a deal. This was about ending it, for good. And if Jack still had people on the outside, then Jake was going to hunt every last one of them down. The deal was made. Viper had given them names. Real names. Not street tags, not half-assed rumors. Confirmed locations. Safe houses, weapons caches. Accounts where the last of Jack's money was sitting, waiting to be funneled into the next fight. Jack was locked up, but his network was still breathing. And Jake wasn't about to let it stay that way. He sat in the dimly lit community center, now doubling as the sheriff's office, poring over the files spread out in front of him. Each one represented another threat, another piece of Jack's empire that hadn't been burned away when Red Gorge fought back. Howard walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee, dropping one in front of Jake before pulling up a chair. Been a long time since we had organized crime on our doorstep, Howard muttered. Jake took a sip of the coffee, still staring at the list. Yeah, and we didn't finish the job, Howard sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. We got Jack. He's done. Jake shook his head. Jack was never the real problem. It's the people who believe in him, the ones who are still out there. He tapped a name on the list. Like this guy, Preston Lee, ex-military. Used to run shipments for Jack across 3 states. Howard glanced at the file, frowning. He's still active? Viper says he's sitting in a cabin 2 hours out of town. Jake's jaw clenched. If that's true, we need to move before he disappears. Howard leaned back, exhaling. We're stretched thin, Jake. Half the town's busy fixing what they lost. The other half is running security, just in case anyone tries something. We don't have the manpower for an out-of-town hunt. Jake knew that. But he also knew what happened when you left men like Preston Lee alone. They regrouped, they rearmed, and then they came back. Jake tapped the file again. We can't wait, Howard. If we don't handle this now, we're gonna regret it. Howard studied him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, but we're not doing this alone. Jake raised an eyebrow. You got reinforcements I don't know about? Howard smirked. Something like that. The meeting was called that afternoon. The town gathered in what remained of the church, one of the few buildings that had come through the fight mostly intact. Wooden benches had been pushed together, forming rows of seats for people who no longer knew how to sit still. These weren't just survivors. They were fighters now. Jake stood at the front of the room, scanning the faces of the people who had stood their ground during the attack. Sam Lawson, still wearing the same old flannel, his arms crossed over his chest. Jerry, rubbing a scarred hand over his jaw, listening intently. Martinez, still banged up but alert. And behind them, the town, farmers, shopkeepers, ranchers, people who had once lived in peace but had now been forced into war. Howard stepped forward, clearing his throat. All right, folks. We all know why we're here. Murmurs of agreement. Howard nodded toward Jake. Nolan's been working with some new information. Jake took a slow breath. He wasn't a speech guy, but he needed them to understand. Jack's gone, he started, but he wasn't working alone. He had people on the outside, and some of them? He glanced around the room. They're still waiting for their chance to come back. The murmurs grew louder, angrier. Jerry stood. Then we end it. A few nods. A few mutters of damn right. Sam spoke next. We can't just wait for them to regroup. Not after what happened. Martinez nodded. We've got names. We've got locations. We know where they are. Jake let the silence settle for a moment. We don't have enough deputies, he admitted. We don't have SWAT. We don't have an army. Howard looked at him. But what we do have is a town that ain't afraid anymore. And that was it. The decision had already been made before Jake even called the meeting. Red Gorge wasn't just defending itself anymore. It was fighting back. They moved fast. By nightfall, teams were assigned. Small groups of volunteers, armed and ready, would guard the town while Jake and a handful of others took the fight beyond the borders. The plan was simple. Hit Preston Lee's hideout first. See if they could flush out more names. And if they did, they kept going until there wasn't a single damn piece of Jack's network left standing. Martinez was riding shotgun in Jake's truck as they tore down the empty highway. Behind them, 2 more vehicles followed, Howard in one, Jerry in the other. They weren't law enforcement. They weren't military. But they were men who had fought for their town and weren't done yet. Jake glanced at the rearview mirror. The desert stretched on in every direction, dark and endless. Martinez shifted. "You think this guy's expecting us?" Jake smirked. "I hope so." Shadow sat in the back seat, his ears perked, sensing the shift in the air. Preston Lee wasn't just another gang member. He was the last loose thread. And once he was gone, this war would finally be over. The cabin came into view just after midnight, a rundown shack tucked between the rocks, sitting at the end of a dirt road that hadn't seen traffic in weeks. No lights, no movement. But Jake wasn't stupid enough to assume it was empty. He killed the truck's engine, stepping out into the cool desert night. The others followed, moving quietly, weapons in hand. Shadow tensed, his nose flaring. Jake whispered, "Find him." Shadow moved, slipping into the darkness like a phantom. And then a shot rang out. A bullet ripped through the windshield of Jerry's truck, narrowly missing him. Jake dove for cover, his gun up, scanning the shadows. More gunfire erupted from the cabin. They weren't alone. Martinez cursed, pressing against the truck. "I count 4 shooters." Howard gritted his teeth. "Looks like they knew we were coming," Jake smirked, loading a fresh magazine. Good, because this time, Red Gorge wasn't defending itself. It was finishing what Jack started. Gunfire ripped through the desert night, carving bright streaks through the darkness. Jake moved fast, keeping low, his boots kicking up dust as he slid behind the rusted-out shell of an old truck. Bullets shattered the side mirror, glass raining down over his shoulder. The cabin wasn't just a hideout, it was a bunker. Preston Lee had been preparing for this, which meant he knew exactly who was coming for him. Shadow crouched beside Jake, his body tight with anticipation, golden eyes locked onto the flickering muzzle flashes coming from the cabin's windows. He was waiting for the command. "Howard!" Jake barked. The sheriff was pinned down behind a boulder, his rifle pressed tight against his shoulder. "4 shooters, maybe 5, he called back. "They've got the high ground." Martinez let off 2 quick rounds from his position behind Jerry's truck. "We need to flush them out before they tear us apart." Jake clenched his jaw. Time to change the game. He leaned down, whispering in Shadow's ear. "Go!" The dog launched forward, a blur of black and tan, disappearing into the night. Jake moved right behind him, zigzagging between cover, keeping his head low. His boots hit the ground in a steady rhythm, gun raised, pulse steady. He could hear Shadow moving through the brush, circling around toward the back of the cabin. Then a scream. One of the shooters, hidden behind a stack of crates, went down hard, his rifle skidding across the dirt as Shadow ripped into him. Jake didn't give the others time to react. He popped up, sighted the second target in the window, 1 shot, center mass. The man collapsed inside, knocking over a lamp as he fell. The light inside the cabin shifted, and Jake saw it. Preston. He was running. "Preston's making a break for it," Jake shouted. Martinez fired, but the bullet missed by an inch, kicking up dirt near Preston's boots. The man dove off the back porch, disappearing into the black desert. Jake cursed and took off after him. Shadow was already on the scent, tearing across the dirt, his lean frame cutting through the night like a missile. Jake ran harder. The chase stretched into the desert, boots pounding against the ground, lungs burning with effort. Preston was fast, but he was injured. His movements were desperate, clumsy. Jake closed the distance. Preston scrambled over a small rock formation, breathing raggedly, gripping his side. He had a gun, but his hands were shaking. He turned, aiming wildly, his eyes wide with panic. Jake didn't stop. He tackled him hard, sending them both crashing into the dirt. The gun went flying. Preston fought like an animal, twisting, clawing, throwing elbows, but Jake had the advantage. He flipped him, pinning him face first into the ground, pressing a knee into his spine. "It's over," Jake growled, yanking Preston's hands behind his back. The man thrashed for a second, then collapsed, breathing hard. Shadow trotted up, growling low, standing just inches from Preston's head. Jake yanked out his zip ties, binding Preston's wrists. "You're done." Preston let out a dry laugh, coughing through the dust. "You think this is the end?" Jake tightened the restraints. "I know it is." Preston didn't have a comeback for that. Jake dragged him to his feet, hauling him back toward the cabin. The fight was over. The remaining shooters dead or captured. The others were already securing the site, clearing weapons, burning what was left of Jack's network. It had taken months, but it was finally finished. Red Gorge was safe. For the first time in a long time, Jake let himself breathe. The celebration came 2 days later. It wasn't planned. Nobody had sent invitations or put up decorations. There were no speeches, no officials handing out awards. It was just the town coming together. People gathered in what remained of Main Street, bringing food, drinks, chairs. The diner had reopened, the neon sign flickering back to life. The hardware store had its doors propped open, stocked with new shipments, thanks to donations from nearby towns. And Jerry had already started rebuilding the bar. Jake stood near the makeshift grill that had been set up outside, watching as people laughed again. For the first time in months, there was no fear, no tension, just relief. Howard walked up beside him, nursing a beer. "You look uncomfortable," Jake smirked. "I don't do celebrations." Howard chuckled. "Could have fooled me." Jake watched as kids ran through the street, playing without fear. Parents chatting without glancing over their shoulders. Yeah, maybe this was worth celebrating. Martinez strolled over, a plate of food in one hand, a grin on his face. "You're famous, Nolan. People keep asking me when you're running for mayor." Jake snorted. "They'd regret that real fast." Martinez laughed, shaking his head. "Well, either way, this town owes you." Jake took a slow sip of his drink, glancing around. "They don't owe me anything. They did this. Not me." Martinez nodded. "Maybe, but they had you leading the charge." Jake didn't argue. He just looked down at Shadow, scratching the dog behind the ears. Shadow thumped his tail, happy to finally relax. "Think you're finally getting that break?" Howard asked. Jake exhaled. "Maybe." Howard smirked. "Better enjoy it while it lasts." Jake knew he was right. Peace in a place like Red Gorge didn't last forever. But for now it was enough. The music played, the people laughed, and the town stood together, stronger than it had ever been, and no one would ever take it from them again. The celebration faded into the quiet hum of normal life, returning to Red Gorge. The fires had burned out, the scars remained, but the town endured. Jake had always believed that Red Gorge was a place people passed through, a pit stop in the desert, nothing more. But now, after everything they had survived together, he realized he had been wrong. This town wasn't just a place, it was a family, and for the first time in years, Jake felt like he belonged. The morning after the celebration, Jake sat on his porch, staring out at the endless stretch of desert that framed the town. Shadow lay at his feet, his body relaxed, his golden eyes half-lidded in the sunlight. The dog had earned his rest. Hell, they both had. But Jake knew better than to believe in peace. Howard pulled up in his old truck, dust kicking up in the driveway. He climbed out, stretching with a grunt before walking up the porch steps. "Figured I'd find you here." Jake smirked, taking a sip of his coffee. "You come to tell me the town's already falling apart without me?" Howard snorted. "Nah, we're managing." He sat down in the chair beside Jake, letting out a slow breath as he looked out at the horizon. "Got news, though?" Jake arched an eyebrow. "Good or bad?" Howard took his time answering. "Both." Jake set his mug down. "Let's hear it." Howard reached into his jacket, pulling out a letter, folded and slightly crumpled. "Came in this morning. Official state business." Jake frowned, taking it. The envelope was marked with the Arizona Department of Law Enforcement seal. His gut tightened. He opened it, scanning the words inside, then froze. Effective immediately, the Arizona State K-9 Division has formally recognized Shadow for acts of valor and service above and beyond the call of duty. Jake blinked. Howard smirked. Told you it was good news. Jake shook his head, rereading the letter. They're giving him an official commendation? Not just that. Howard leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. They want to put Shadow on record as an honorary service K-9. First one in state history who ain't actively working with an agency. Jake looked down at Shadow. The dog simply thumped his tail, completely unaware that the state of Arizona had just declared him a legend. Jake chuckled, scratching behind his ears. Guess that makes you a celebrity, huh? Shadow yawned. Howard grinned. There's more. Jake sighed. Of course there is. Howard pulled out another letter, this one with a federal seal. Jake's stomach dropped before he even opened it. It was from the U.S. Marshal's office. Howard watched him carefully. They're taking Jack. Jake stiffened. When? 2 days. Jake clenched his jaw. That's too soon. Howard sighed. Not up to us. The feds don't want him sitting in county, and after what happened here, they don't trust a normal prison to hold him. He hesitated. They're transferring him to Florence Supermax. Jake exhaled slowly. Florence. The worst of the worst was sent there. Terrorists, cartel leaders, domestic threats. If Jack was going anywhere, that was the place. And yet, Jake didn't feel relieved, because he knew Jack wouldn't go down quietly, and if he had people left on the outside, they'd be coming. Howard shifted. You want to be there when they take him? Jake stared at the letter, thought about it, then shook his head. No. Howard raised an eyebrow. No. Jake exhaled. Jack's done. We did our part. It's out of our hands now. Howard studied him. That sound like you convincing me or yourself? Jake chuckled. Maybe both. Howard smirked, then stood, stretching again. Either way, you did good, Nolan. Jake glanced down at Shadow, still lounging lazily, completely unaware of his new title. Honorary K-9. It was fitting. Jake reached down, patting Shadow's head. He did better, Howard nodded. Yeah, he did. He started toward his truck, then paused. You sticking around? Jake looked back at the town, at the people, at the home he had found in the middle of a war zone. Yeah, he said finally. I think I am. Howard grinned. Figured as much. He climbed into his truck, started the engine. See you tomorrow, Nolan. Jake lifted his coffee in a mock toast. Try not to get shot without me. Howard laughed, pulling away. Jake sat back, watching the sun climb higher. Red Gorge had been through hell, but it was still standing, and as long as it did, so would he. Shadow let out a contented sigh, rolling onto his back, paws in the air. Jake shook his head, smiling. Lazy ass. The dog wagged his tail. Jake exhaled, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't waiting for the next fight. For the first time in a long time, he just was. And for now, that was enough.